what's good? Is Miss Stora. Right out the gate, I want to say that South of Midnight took me back to the action adventure games of old that I grew up with. I'm talking about games from like the Jak and Daxter series or Ratchet and Clank. At its heart, South of Midnight is a game that has gameplay very reminiscent to those other ones I just mentioned from back in the day, but tells a more personal story with heavier and more cultural themes woven in. It's something I love about these kinds of games. Kingdom Hearts, for example, I'm a huge fan of. It may appear simple to play and appear lighthearted upon first glance, but as you get entrenched in your playthrough, it's very obvious that there is depth to be found in the gameplay department and a great story experience to be had. To call back to Jak and Daxter, particularly for me, Jak 2 and 3, I remember feeling like its dark and gritty but well-told narrative truly resonated with me, and I feel like some of the same stuff can be said about South of Midnight here. But to keep it real, this game is not perfect. It definitely won't be like a game of the year contender for me personally, as it has a fair amount of flaws. Despite how complete of a game and experience it is, those flaws do affect my score of it. But overall, it's a title that I considered more than worth my time. I had a blast getting to play through and experience Hazel's story. So without further ado, let's jump into the details of why I feel like it's a very solid game and more about those flaws I mentioned and ultimately what I give it in terms of an overall score, all with no spoilers. First up, I want to reiterate, even though I just said it, that this game is a complete and full experience. South of Midnight doesn't have any modern gaming add-ons, and as a result, conversely, nor does it have any bits of it removed or forgotten, only to be patched in later after the game has been released via updates or even worse, sold to you as DLC to make it feel whole. The game is $40 at full price, and if you can find it on sale somewhere, I highly encourage you to get it, but it's also available on Game Pass. And to me, whether you go about playing it via, the subscription route or just purchasing it to own it outright, either way, it's well worth the, 10 to 12 hours I suspect most people are gonna get out of it. Unfortunately, as my first mark against South of Midnight, I will say it doesn't really offer any substantial or worthwhile replayability, at least not for me. There are collectibles that you can go back and acquire and, play through the game to get if you missed them. And there are multiple difficulty modes, but to me, that doesn't warrant another playthrough in of itself. I experienced a story, which I liked a lot, and said story definitely hit me in the feels more than once. The gameplay was dope overall, even if it does have a, few small hiccups, which I'm going to discuss shortly. So in general, I feel satisfied with what I got out of it. But whereas some of those classic action adventure games that I was talking about had some of those same great aspects while also having replayability, South of Midnight just doesn't. I replayed the Jak and Daxter games, Kingdom Hearts games, over and over, but that's just not the case here for this title. So in terms of value, I would still definitely say it's worth it. You get a really good 10 to 12 hour game, but is not something I think most people will be coming back in order to experience the whole thing all over again. Now let's get into the meat and potatoes of this thing though and talk gameplay. I played the game on hard difficulty from my first and only playthrough, which was recommended to me by someone, and I also highly recommend you do the same as well if you haven't already played it. The combat has a good amount of challenge as a result of that higher difficulty, leading to me feeling like I had to utilize all my tools and just not do the same thing in the same sequence over and over in combat. I see online that some people have complained that, the fights get repetitive and or boring. However, while playing on the hard difficulty, I personally, I don't feel like that's the case. Yeah, to start, Hazel doesn't have a whole lot she can do in combat, but as you'll see in the story, she's new to this whole, quote, fighting haints, unquote thing. You know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't take long for her to kind of get used to things though and start getting new abilities in combat and exploration as well as platforming. The game does dish out these new toys and abilities at a steady and consistent pace, which in a game that isn't super long, again, it's that 10 to 12 hour mark, means that you're always going to have something new to mess around with pretty often. Now, I will definitely say the skill tree could have offered more. You know what I'm saying? It was all right. Nothing special, nothing that I hated or disliked. I did like the upgrades that I got. I won't say I didn't like any of them. And I do like how none of them were these really small, like minuscule things, such as small passive boosts. I hate in action adventure games getting an entire level up or getting a bunch of, upgrade currency only to unlock a small 3% plus to something. It annoys me, but that did not happen here in South of Midnight. I liked what I got in the upgrades, but I'll also say I was never like insanely hyped up whenever I did unlock something either. But that doesn't mean that what's there isn't fun, because it definitely is. When you start to weave your abilities in with melee combos and charge attacks just at the right moments, you start to see the ebb and flow of combat play out as you push, pull, stun, and even temporarily mind control enemies over to your side. It results in a game that, like I said, has a similar feel combat wise to some of those older action adventure games, and it just couldn't help it. I had a big smile on my face after I went from dying a few times in a given tough encounter to masterfully executing my plan and desired combos, I was making Hazel look like she'd been fighting these corrupted spirits for decades. Like I said, it was just putting a smile on my face. It's the same feeling that you would have gotten in like the old God of War games. I'm not talking like the PlayStation recent PS4, PS5 games. Those God of War games are great, but I'm talking like the old ones, right? It's a similar feeling there when you felt so locked into the combat after learning your abilities as a player character duo, as well as the abilities of the enemies, that eventually you felt like you were predicting their moves before the enemies would even make them, outright dodging and counterattacking stuff that's even coming at you from off screen. That kind of feeling. Now, it definitely could have been better, the combat, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't have plenty of awesome moments fighting Heinz as Hazel. I do want to mention though that I'm not a fan. I like the combat, but I'm not a fan of how combat was in terms of like where it took place, like these arenas that you fight in. See, you don't just happen across enemies while you're exploring a level. Instead, every fight takes place in an arena. You can see this stigma of negative energy that you have to cleanse while you're exploring, but every single one of these stigma is smack dab in the middle of an arena that is just placed within the levels. Yeah, they do blend in, having the same appearance and aesthetic of whatever locale you're currently set in, but they pretty much all have the same dimensions, or there's very little difference in terms of their size, and are just big flat circles that you fight in. I personally would have liked to have fought the enemies out in the world organically, having them just appear and be spread out through a given chapter. Given how creepy some of these Haints, that's the main enemies of the game, how creepy some of them move, and the scary sounds they make, it seems like a bit of a missed opportunity to have the player on edge, worrying about the ever-present threat of Haints ready to jump out at you from the shadows. The game has this excellent level design with how good the platforming and the verticality is. With all that being true and present, it's just a damn shame that none of it ever gets utilized in combat as well. Like I said, it just feels like a missed opportunity somewhere along the way, and it leads to these encounters that, while in terms of the fighting itself, they do feel different, because of the combos of enemies that are thrown at you, all of Hazel's abilities and whatnot. These encounters can't help but at least visually come across as pretty samey. This, combined with how progressing to the end of the level is done, you kind of start to know how the flow and events of a level are gonna play out, at least to an extent. At certain points, I knew what each level would consist of. Okay, I got like 3 to 4 of these things, these stigmas I have to cleanse. Each of those is gonna have an arena fight attached, with the other arena fights being present to take place as well, with it going on and on from there. Now, the level design in terms of physical layout and the platform to find unlockables thankfully helped to make this not as big of an issue, as that stuff was excellent, but it still impacted my opinion on the game for sure. For more details on my experience with combat on hard, I want to say I died like a dozen or so times, feeling like it was definitely my fault whenever I did. Sometimes I would lock onto enemies when I should have just been using the free camera, I didn't use my abilities at the correct time, and things like that. You know, enemies were also pretty tanky and they hit hard, so learning how and when to combo abilities as well as learning enemy prioritization did unlock a nice kind of, flow state while fighting at times. Oh, and some of the enemy combinations this game throws at you to have you fight all at once just straight up had me like, are you serious? Like, this is completely unfair. It definitely forced me to lock in. I do also enjoy the difficulty from a story aspect, because while Hazel is awesome, one of the cooler MCs I've seen in the video game, at least just recently, super recently, she's a weaver that has all these really cool and stylish abilities. Still though, she's technically human, so I feel like her having to be very careful in spite of all these dope powers she has is cool. Like, even the weakest Haint should still be a substantial threat, and what makes Hazel so cool is she's able to just constantly deal with these threats. I'd say for sure that the combat overall is a good time to be had, even if I wish the skill tree was better and that Hazel had maybe 1 or 2 more abilities at her disposal for fighting. Although I definitely wish enemy variety was a bit better. This is another element where the game falls prey to some visual sameness, in my opinion. Like, there were a lot of different Haints and mythical creatures to fight, but for the Haints specifically, because they are all made of these red and black masses of negative energy, they feel very samey, despite their different features and characteristics. Kind of like the mold enemies from Resident Evil 7. The enemies may have been different in terms of how they were modeled or just various ways, but visually, because of what they were made of, they kind of all look the same. The controls though felt tight and responsive, which extends to platforming. I consider the platforming mad fun and arguably the best part of the game from a pure gameplay perspective, especially in segments where you're going all over the level exploring to find hidden collectibles throughout a given segment. So there's no complaints there. While I enjoyed some of the puzzles and they itched my brain in a very satisfying way, many of them were just simply too easy. Primarily anything that involved grabbing an object to throw it at something, as it's pretty obvious all of the time what it is that you need to throw said thing at, with the camera just straight up like heavily gravitating towards the obstacle that you have to throw it at in question. I could have did without those puzzles and enjoyed the game just as much, if not a tiny bit more. I will also add that South of Midnight does lose a good amount of steam towards the end, not necessarily story-wise, but specifically in terms of gameplay. The final boss fight can't really be called a boss fight, is the most I can say without spoilers, and the gameplay segments towards the end in general are kind of repetitive. So yeah, overall, I would definitely say rock solid for the gameplay. There's a good amount to like, but there are some blemishes and you are going to notice them. Next, we're going to talk about the story. What made the biggest impression on me is how, like I said, I talked about it a bit earlier, but just I had a huge smile on my face so often during this game. It just brought me so much joy, as well as, of course, a wide array of other emotions. The story makes it a point to pull at your heartstrings in more ways than one, but also does a very good job of getting you to think. Usually, I'm very good at predicting where narratives are going to go in any media that I consume, but for like the first half of the game, there was so much intrigue and I legitimately had no idea where things were going. So props there for sure. Again, No spoilers, but the premise is essentially that Hazel and her mom start off the game trying to get ready to head to a shelter to wait out a severe hurricane that's coming in. Her mother is late to finishing up with the prep due to reasons that fit into the mother character's backstory. This causes an argument between Hazel and her mom that ultimately leads to them being separated in the midst of this intense storm, which causes the beginning of Hazel's journey to rescue her mom, with the twist of her discovering that she's something called a weaver along the way, which gives her connections to spirits and powers that aid in mending broken bonds and cleansing negative energies. Now, that's all I want to say as far as the premise is concerned, but I do want to mention that to me, I was satisfied with how the plot played out and the game's conclusion narratively, even if I do wish that certain chapters' conclusions specifically had a bit more to them or more fleshed out. Overall, things were really solid in the story and I really dug it a lot. Like, to explain what I was talking about though, with there being a bit more fleshed outness, I guess you could say, there's a confrontation at the end of a chapter early on in the game that I was fully anticipating would happen, but it never did. I expected that confrontation to happen so much that I legit thought I had missed something at first. I re-explored the entire level to make sure I didn't miss anything, but no. Hazel resolved something regarding a mythical creature that was just incredibly tragic and just awful, yet the game lets you continue on. She exits the level and does nothing to confront the source of that occurrence. It was just weird to me. Oh, and there's a major character whom Hazel helps out that has a lot of significance to her life as a character that I fully expected to be around more, supporting and helping throughout the later parts of the adventure, not taking the spotlight, but just being there as a supportive role. But they don't show up, especially because this is someone who deeply cares for Hazel and her mother. That makes it a lot more puzzling for me. They also didn't show up in the ending, which, as you can see, it didn't impact my overall enjoyment of said ending or even the story at large, considering I think the plot overall was fantastic, but I was fully expecting this character to show up in the ending. I know as of late, we want games to tell us less and show us more, but in these few cases specifically, it seems like neither happened. It's definitely a story that starts out intense and shocking though, but I wouldn't say it's too much. It balances well while touching on some heavy subjects and themes, with culture ultimately at its center. That culture being a lot of African American influence, but also African spiritualism in of itself, and deep Southern US culture. Think places like New Orleans, the Bayou, as well as other influences from Louisiana, but also places like Alabama. Tied directly to that is the game's heavy and excellent usage of its music, which I'm gonna go into more detail on in a bit, but music is such an integral part to many of the cultures that are given the spotlight in this game. It doesn't disappoint because it's incredibly well made with these cultures in mind while being tied to the story directly for excellent effect. And growing up black myself, I resonated with a lot of what was on screen. My father is full-blooded African American and my mother is full-blooded Puerto Rican. So I'm a 50-50 mix of the two. So with that, there was a lot in this game that I felt like I could resonate with. And it was beautiful to see so much of my culture and the culture of my ancestors on full, proud display. And I loved it. Throughout my playtime, this was evident in aspects like, again, the music, which is easily a highlight of this game, to the various locales, such as what I consider potentially like one of the best iterations of a New Orleans inspired level I've ever seen in the video game, all the way to even those small touches, such as houses being painted in haint blue partially, a shade of blue that was used a lot in houses back in the day in the Deep South, as it was believed to ward off evil spirits, aka haints. As a result of all that influence, well thought out execution, research, stop motion inspired animation, and more, I feel like you're left with a game that just oozes style, okay? To speak on that stop motion animation for a second, I personally am a fan of it. For the gameplay segments, I did turn it off, as a personal preference, which is something I'm glad that we can do. I just like that smoother visual stuff for the fighting, but nevertheless, when the cutscenes were playing, I'd happily kick back and enjoy the beautiful presentation, art direction, and again, the stop motion style animation. I know I said it before, but special recognition, we gonna keep talking about it. The music, okay? It might be the best part of the game. I'm not gonna hold you because it extends to more than music for me, right? It's the excellent choice to bake it right into the game as a storytelling mechanism. The tracks play at key parts of the story and during key gameplay segments. These tracks being used as direct storytelling devices as they reference what's going on in the plot. Like they're written to go alongside these events. For example, you could be fighting a boss with a track in the background that details that boss's backstory and why the given fight is all relevant, you know, with style, flair, and a production level that is damn near unmatched when compared to other games. Think like, for recent memory, think like the Baldur's Gate 3 Raphael boss fight when you're fighting this devil in his home domain and you're not expecting to, but this just awesome song plays during the fight that isn't just a song for background sake. Like it's a storytelling device. It's Raphael himself singing, potentially in the middle of the fight that's going on, and it's talking about stuff that's related to everything that's been going on throughout your adventure. I will say there's, you know, a wide variety of genres at play with regard to the music, and it was so well done that I now listen to many of those tracks as background music while I'm studying or working on content. For voice acting and overall characterization, everyone was solid, and there were no bad performances or anything that stuck out negatively, in my opinion. Adrian Ray, specifically, who voices the main character Hazel, was phenomenal. Everything from the funny and lighthearted moments to the serious and somber ones was executed so damn well. I hope we get to see more of her, you know, her talent in future video games as well, because to my knowledge, while she's an experienced actress, she doesn't really dip her toes in a voice acting much, but I'd love to see it. Lastly, to talk about performance, I'll say that this shouldn't need to be a bonus, but in today's PC gaming landscape, I will say it's nice to have a game that runs flawlessly at launch on my rig, which I would consider mid-range. This comes after me simply just not being able to enjoy myself while playing the recent Oblivion remaster due to its technical issues. And, you know, not just because I have a mid-range PC, even people with godlike, just top of the line spec PCs had all these issues with the Oblivion remaster, and that game isn't alone. It's just one of the more recent ones that I played that was poorly optimized. But I'm happy to report that the folks over at Compulsion Games did their thing when it came to optimizing this title. With all that said, we now arrive at my verdict, my score. What is South of Midnight to me as an overall package? I'm gonna score this game a 7.8 out of 10. It's just shy of being what I'd say is awesome. It's still a very good game, hell, a great one, but it's shy of that next tier of greatness, in my opinion, if that makes sense. Primarily due to the aspects of the game I found less than fun and it being quite samey at some points. Not for like the combat or anything, thankfully, or else I do think I'd be giving the game a lower score, but in terms of how chapters and levels were laid out with how you complete them, as well as the lack of enemy variety. There's other aspects that negatively impacted the score too for me, such as, you know, certain resolutions at the end of chapters specifically and weak puzzles. But South of Midnight more than makes up for those shortcomings that's a funny way I said the word shortcomings in terms of what it gets right, is, you know, such as its challenging and fun combat on that hard difficulty, the great story, the smooth platforming, incredible presentation, the themes, the influences, the culture on display, its solid price point, and its banging music. If you've been craving something that reminds you of classic games, old school action adventure ones, or just looking for a great action adventure game to dive into that won't take dozens of hours of your time to complete, I do definitely recommend giving South of Midnight a try. That's gonna do it for this video, y'all, but I'm curious, have you played South of Midnight? If so, what did you think? If not, what are your impressions and why haven't you maybe given it a shot yet? Be sure to let me know in the comments below, and as always, I'll see you in the next video. Be easy.